is Taj of the Beat.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, guys, gals, and non-binary pals to another episode of All the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, and I've been a middle and high school principal and a high school social studies teacher. And as always, I'm joined by
Manuel Rustin, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. I'm a high school history teacher. I teach high school in the Los Angeles area, and I've been at it for 16 years. And you are here at All the Above, a show where we take a look at recent news and headlines in education and dive deep into some of the ongoings in our field, because we know, like you know, that education does not get the attention that it deserves. So we're here to bring some of that attention and bring some of these issues to light. Thank you for listening. If you are listening on the go, if you're watching this on YouTube, thank you for that. Please remember to hit that subscribe button so we can get our subscriber numbers up a little bit. And remember, you could always go to our website, aotashow.com, for links to all the stories we talk about and all the different platforms upon which you can watch or listen to all of the above.
Indeed.
Indeed. So, Jeff, what's on today's agenda?
Well, Manuel, as usual, we got a good one for everybody.
Yeah.
I am excited to announce that we are revealing a very special guest today who our most dedicated followers will recognize.
Yeah.
But she has assumed a new and glorious title. Our senior middle school correspondent, here on All of the Above, is going to be joining us today, Miss Genevieve DuBose Akinagbe. So super exciting to have her back with us. And she is going to be helping us unpack a really interesting conversation about kind of the career trajectory of educators. And I think it's fair to say for a lot of us, you might reach a point in your career where you kind of hit a low spot, right?
Yeah.
Where maybe you're questioning, did I make the right choice? Is this right for me?
Right.
And you've got to, dig deep and gut check and kind of find your way back to a place of thriving and sustainability. So we're going to talk about that today with Genevieve, our senior middle school correspondent. I like saying the senior there, especially.
That's big time,
because
man.
nobody wants to just be the regular middle school correspondent.
Nah. Come on now.
But of course, we're going to start off with a fascinating Do Now. We've got some headlines. We're going to talk about all the juicy news and education that regular media wasn't telling you about, that you need to know about, because, these are important stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't wait. All right. Up next is our Do Now. All right, folks, now it's time for the Do Now. Let's take a look at some recent headlines in education. Jeff, how are we doing the Do Now today?
Well, Manuel, we have a lexicon today, and I think, you are a social studies teacher. I was a social studies teacher. We know the importance of vocabulary as a fundamental building block of all learning, so we're going to get into some vocabulary today.
Dope.
Yeah, let's
Sounds
do it.
good. What's the first lexicon term today, Jeff?
Here we go, Manuel. Our first term today, grub.
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 I could use some food right now. That's the type of grub you're talking about, right?
I was thinking we're going more like nascent infant flies, like a larva. Yeah,
we don't do that on this show, Jeff. That will be for a science or biology podcast, perhaps.
Yes. Okay. Grub. Here we go. Grub, as in, like hungry, right? We're gonna throw down a little bit, or at least you might. If the advice that's given by a recent article published in Chalkbeat coming out of New York City with results of an interesting study about the effects of universal free school lunch on student achievement has anything to do with it.
Nice.
So here we go. A new study out of Syracuse University's Center for Policy Research assessed the impact of universal free lunch on students who previously didn't have access to a universal free lunch program. Now, the researchers found statistically significant bumps in reading and math test scores once students attended a school with universal free lunch. So for folks in our audience, hopefully everyone's aware that we have for a long time had a certain set of students, particularly the lowest income students who qualified for free lunch. But in the United States, where we have lots of people who are lower on the income spectrum, there's there's this other slice of students who are not qualifying for free lunch, but maybe still struggling to provide lunch, for their student. And so this study, I think, is maybe shedding some light on the larger impacts of moving to a policy of saying school lunch is free for everyone. So, Manuel, what are your thoughts? You are a teacher. You see kids sixth period right after lunch, right? Or fifth period, whatever it is. What do you think here?
So yeah, this study. The study was out of Syracuse University Center for Policy Research. You might have said that. I might have missed that. But what I really appreciate is that they found statistically significant impacts of providing universal free lunch for everybody, even students who didn't qualify for free lunch before. So as a teacher, this reminded me of a field trip that I took years back, and the cafeteria workers needed us to submit the students' lunch numbers for the students who are on free or reduced lunch so that we could get a bagged lunch for them. So not everybody on the field trip qualified for that. So we had a certain number of bagged lunch from the cafeteria that particular year, and it really highlighted the stigma associated with being that kid that gets the free lunch. So one of the co-authors of this study, Amy Ellen Schwartz, she pointed out that the big takeaway is that if we make lunch free, kids do better in school, and not just the kids who were qualifying for free or reduced lunch, but those who didn't qualify before. That stigma of going and being the one to grab the free lunch is gone, because now everybody gets a free lunch, even those who income-wise don't qualify. So reducing that stigma means students are eating more, presumably, and of course, with eating more, they're in a better physical state to learn. And this is example number 3,401 of the fact that you could raise test scores without necessarily having to strip back electives and double up on math and English and do all these, super rigorous academic things. Sometimes raising test scores can come down to something like making sure the students are healthy,
having
and
meals,
ate that day. Yes. So yeah, sounds great to me.
Yeah. So it is one of those things that maybe comes across as like, duh, how do we not know this? But
Right.
I think where maybe the nuance is in the story is the kind of social dynamics that play out in a situation where everyone has access to the same food and there's no stigma attached, right? Which apparently seems to, and I would imagine, results in just more people eating, period.
Right.
Right? And that the fact that more people are eating means students are better positioned to focus, feel comfortable, not have headaches, not be tired, right? In those last 2-3 periods of the day, in most secondary schools at least, after lunch, when teachers know those can be some of the toughest periods to teach in the day, and and where we want to be doing everything we can to stack the deck in our favor of keeping kids engaged, right? So I think it's a really interesting story for that fact. I think also what was interesting to me is that they noted at the end of the Chalkbeat article that the study did not find similar effects around providing universal school breakfast, which I thought was interesting. They didn't explain much, so there's not a lot of data we have here to report back on that. But that stood out to me because I wondered why there would be such a big distinction between these significantly positive results with free lunch, but not with free breakfast.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as a high school teacher, I could only guess what that has something to do with students arriving in time for that free breakfast. But that, at the high school level, I'm having, students are bringing themselves to school on public transportation or whatever, and sometimes barely making it in time for class, let alone early enough to grab their free lunch. But that's just my own anecdotal experience as a high school teacher. So yeah, I'm definitely curious about that. I would like to add though that if you're watching this video on YouTube, it's likely that there's already a thumbs down on it, because we seem to get one single thumbs down on most of the videos that we post. And we suspect we see you, Betsy DeVos is the one behind it. But the Trump administration, so her superiors have actually proposed cutting the amount of free lunch that is out there. So not only not moving towards universal, but actually cutting back from what's already there. So they proposed looking at a change in the eligibility for free reduced lunch in order to save $90 million a year, which is about 0.02% of the total federal budget. But of course, we know the Trump administration is very, very, very much focused on cutting costs and being fiscally responsible. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, they've only run up like $900 billion in deficits. So,
yeah, but if you trim enough free school lunches, then,
this one calendar year.
But those kids and those lunches, man, got to save, got to cut costs, and
exactly.
make up for that.
Exactly. These people hate children, man.
Yeah.
I'm convinced, like, they really don't like kids.
And there are likely people who've heard the story or watching the story or listening. Actually, I don't think any of our listeners will think this, but there are people out there who say, well, it's not the job of schools to feed kids. That's up to their folks, their parents, and if they're not doing it, like, that's on them. And I can't help but reject any notion that, especially for children, living below the poverty line, that like they should be punished somehow and not offered free lunch when they show up. Like, we just hate the poor in this country, and that's a tragedy.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what, I agree that it is crazy that we rely on schools as institutions to feed children. So we can agree on that. But then, of course, the rest of the conversation is how do we ensure every family in this country has enough money and enough access to good, healthy, nutritious food in their neighborhood, a walkable or short drivable distance from home, that they can actually feed their children 3 healthy meals a day.
Yeah.
So if you want to have, let's talk $20 minimum wage. Let's talk about, community produce
Socialism,
co-ops
Jeff.
in every community.
Socialism.
I know, wild.
Freebies
crazy.
for everybody, Jeff. Why work?
Imagine the radical notion of everyone having access to food and clothes and shelter. It is. That's crazy. I know. I should relax.
It's a crazy world out there, Jeff.
Yeah.
All right. Next lexicon term. Next up, we have targeted.
Targeted. So I'm thinking like, precise. Like GPS. We're gonna target something so we get it exactly. Minutes, longitude, and latitude. Targeted.
Yeah, maybe. If you want to look at it in the sense of a 15-year-old high school girl feeling that her school has targeted her for speaking out against sexual violence on campus. I don't know if that's GPS. I don't think GPS will let you target a
might be a slightly different
there.
Understanding of the term targeted.
Slightly different.
Let's get into it.
So a 15-year-old girl in Maine was suspended for bullying after trying to draw attention to what she believed was an under-addressed problem of sexual assaults at her high school campus. Now, this story, we got it from the Associated Press, and the student in question, Ayla Mansman, is a sophomore at Cape Elizabeth High School, and she was suspended after posting a note in the restroom that read, quote, "There's a rapist in our school, and you know who it is." She and 2 other girls who left similar notes were also suspended. And along with the ACLU, she is taking her school and district to court, basically saying that she's been targeted and that she has taken a public stance as an ally for victims and survivors of sexual violence. Jeff, what do you think about this 15-year-old being suspended over putting up that note in the restroom?
So, man, well, I don't think that this student should have been suspended. I think that what the student is expressing, and as I understand it, also there were 3 other students who were suspended whose names have not been released. Of course, Ayla is a minor, so typically, names of students wouldn't be released. But Ayla, as the public face of this currently, I don't think she should have been suspended. I think that the school district's perspective here, that there is apparently a male student, this coming from a statement from the principal, whose name is Jeffrey Shedd, said in a letter to the community that a male student believed he was the target of the note campaign and that he felt unsafe at school in the wake of the notes. Now, Ayla and apparently other students have maintained that they intentionally did not put a particular student's, any particular student's name on it, and that they're more largely doing issue advocacy here. So I think, to me, it does not cross the boundary of something where the student should have been suspended. It's certainly speaking about a very relevant issue, an issue that we need absolutely to talk much more about, particularly in our high schools, right? So that we don't, hopefully, see the kinds of really troubling statistics we see around sexual assaults, sexual harassment, etc., at the college level, right? Like we need to talk to kids about it before they get there, before they begin, before most students begin engaging in sexual behavior with others, right? And so I think it's well within the bounds of speech that should be protected. On the other hand, I do think the school has a legitimate interest in investigating the situation and saying, like, is there any adverse effect on another student? Now, not knowing all the particulars about this male student who says he felt targeted, some questions come to mind to me, like, does this male student have a reason to feel targeted, right? And are there larger issues at play in the school where these incidences are happening, or precursor kinds of lower level incidences are happening and going unaddressed? And to what extent Ayla and her friends or her colleagues here are simply just touching the nerve, right? That is letting the school district know we have some work to do, right? So I don't agree with her suspension. I think her case, I would actually not be surprised if her case actually prevailed in the end.
So there was a walkout at her school. About 50 students in support of Ayla walked out of classes in protest of this suspension. And I think it really highlights the fact that schools, not just schools, obviously, but schools are for sure having to grapple with the reality of the Me Too era and what it looks like when a girl on campus accuses another student or another teacher of sexual assault or harassment or anything of the like. Because the reality is, across the nation, across our industry, across our field of work, there are many, many, many women teachers, but when we look at administrators, there's a predominance of men administrators. And here you have a male principal suspending a student for what she says is showing herself as an ally. And the story that we pulled this from referenced another high school where a student was similarly suspended for complaining about a teacher's behavior. And it turned out years later, that teacher was involved in inappropriate relationships with girls on campus, and that teacher was subsequently fired and that student's suspension had been expunged or whatever. But when you have a whole bunch of male administrators running around not taking claims like this seriously or not knowing what to do and just, reaching for that, like, oh, well, this note is causing a problem and this student here feels bullied by it, so you're suspended, that's really a problem. And I think having male overrepresentation in leadership roles in education, because of the history of patriarchy and misogyny in our field, is not helping our field adjust to the reality of what the Me Too movement represents in terms of being able to speak out and call out abusers.
Yeah, I agree, and I think here's what it really boils down to me. Let's say that Ayla and her friends were actually, in some kind of sort of underhanded way trying to target this particular male student, right? Even in that case, I still think as an administrator, how do you respond to this situation, right? Like, clearly these are young women who are addressing a plague of justice issue in our society, right? That needs to be addressed, that school absolutely has an important role to play in helping to address. And your response is to suspend her, right? And silence this speech. Like, I don't see how that's helpful. Right? I really don't. And so I think even if what your concern is that, hey, the putting up of these kind of potentially incendiary notes on the wall, right, maybe is creating a situation that's not helpful because it's just turning a rumor mill. And like, we work in high schools, like stuff happens when rumors, fly, right? But at least engage with her and let's think about how, so what can we do in the school and how might we elevate her leadership in this work to help address these issues, right? And so instead of ostracizing her and challenging her, bring her into the fold, build on what she's talking about, right? Like, it's a real opportunity to engage students about something they clearly care about and are passionate about, and that is obviously right for us to address. So it seems like at best, this is just like a real missed opportunity. Big time missed opportunity.
And, if what she was alleging is true, think about the girls on campus who, she got suspended for putting out a note that something is going on.
Yeah.
So if she got suspended just for that, imagine what the other girls on campus are thinking about what their outlook might be if they took the further step, which is to actually call out the individual, that violated them.
Yeah.
That's just this principle,
Yeah,
in my opinion, is just like making it to where no one's going to want to say anything there.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's not a good look.
Not a good look.
Yeah.
All right. Next story, next lexicon term. What do we have, Jeff?
All right, man. Well, next lexicon term is damaged.
Damaged. Well, there are definitely some damaged futures at this school that we were just talking about in terms of all this craziness. I don't know if this story is at all related to suspensions on campuses or anything like that.
It certainly is. Most certainly is. And before we get into the details, though, I think we got to give a little bit of shout out here, because this story comes to us via the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which just so happens to be the intellectual stomping grounds of the two hosts here on All the Above.
Indeed.
So shout out to the folks in Cambridge. We appreciate being able to share some good stories from our school. And so let's get into it, right?
Yeah.
Damaged. Funny we should be talking about suspension 2 stories in a row here.
Yeah.
So a new working paper recently published by the National Bureau of Economic Research reports that schools with higher suspension rates have substantial negative long-run impacts. Now, in some ways, this is nothing new. We've thought about this and talked. We did a whole episode around this back in season 1. But here's some new interesting wrinkles. Suspensions did not have a statistically significant impact on positive student achievement overall. And we've long heard from folks that the purpose of suspensions is to keep everything orderly so that achievement can continue. These researchers did not corroborate that finding. They found no long-term benefits of suspensions were found in any represented subgroup, right? So this is a fascinating finding, Manuel.
Yeah.
And among several things in this story, which I think we'll unpack, but what do you think?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting story in terms of its research methods, because I think, like you said, we've long discussed the impact that suspensions have, and of course, school-to-prison pipeline is not a controversial phrasing or term at all these days. But this study was able to look at a district in North Carolina, a pretty large district, that redistricted, and that gave the researchers a perfect opportunity to see what impact having a higher suspension rate type of school might have on a student, because here you had a student population, some of whom were in schools with high suspension rates, and now they were being moved to other schools that had lower suspension rates. Some were coming from the lower suspension rate going to a higher suspension rate school, and some, of course, were staying in the same school. And the researchers found that the suspension rates at these schools didn't really change much after this redistricting. So the suspension rates had a lot more to do with policy and leadership than they did the actual kids in the building, which is one level of I guess interesting. One interesting nugget about the story. But also, what they found were students, even those who weren't being suspended, those who were at schools that had higher suspension rates, there were negative outcomes for them. And having more students being suspended did not make the learning environment something to where achievement rose because of that. It did not make the learning environment more conducive to higher test scores at all. And teacher after teacher from coast to coast will tell you that one of the big things that you grapple with as a teacher is that decision to maybe send a student out of class, because on the one hand, that's not solving anything and you want to give the student your best shot and give them every opportunity, but on the other hand, you got to think about the other students in the room and how their education is being impacted. And this study found that that mindset of having a student leave the classroom through suspension, through whatever, was not actually conducive to heightened academic achievement for the rest of the students. So that's new.
Yeah. So I think that's a really fascinating new finding. The other thing, or one of the other things about the story I thought was really interesting that gives some new context to the, I think districts across the country are like, we need to reduce suspension rates.
Right.
And there are pros and cons to that as using suspension rate as a measure of school culture and school safety, right? Because it's very easy to move without actually changing any of the culture inside of a school. But One of the co-authors of the study, a guy named Andrew Bacher Hicks from Harvard, said one of the arguments in favor of suspensions is that if a student is removed from the classroom, they're no longer causing disruptions, and so removing disruptive students could have positive benefits on those who remain in the classroom. But we found for all students there are large negative impacts on later life outcomes related to attending a school with a high suspension rate. That suggests there are not overwhelmingly positive benefits to removing disruptive peers from the classroom. So the longitudinal nature of the study and discovering that, as we have long thought, that students who are repeatedly suspended are more likely to experience incarceration later in life, they were able to test in this very unique context, which is take a kid who earlier in their educational career had been in a school with higher suspensions, move them into a school with lower suspensions, and they still experienced a greater likelihood of being incarcerated later in life, right? Even after being placed in a different school, right? So even early exposure that gets mitigated, hopefully by a better educational environment, that those negative effects can stay with a student over the long term. And I think that's a very new piece of the study here that we haven't been able to not only discuss statistically, but also test in this, this sort of interesting experimental way, because Charlotte Mecklenburg redistricted, right? And so you got to kind of have these control groups or comparison groups at least to measure against. So fascinating aspect of the study there also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just reminds us that not only do we have to look at policies regarding suspensions, but as an individual teacher, it's really important to dig deep and do some reflection and reach out for resources to help when it comes down to that classroom management decision of so-and-so is acting up and so-and-so is out of control, and what am I going to do besides send him out? I actually had a recent conversation with a teacher that I'm pretty close to about a student that is just really, really, really just all over the place in terms of movement and behavior, and it's totally fine kid, but just like so much energy and just gets up and does this, does that, always touching things around the room and this and that, and this teacher was talking about how that student and other students in the room were questioning, like, why don't you just send him out? Why don't you send him out? Send him out, send him out. And that teacher is working hard to not have that be the go-to, because for one, the student is used to being sent out all the time, but also just this idea that, doing that has such a negative impact on that student, but also the class is asking for that student to be sent out and you send that student out. It's also reinforcing this idea that that is the solution for when somebody's so-called out of line or whatever. And this study shows that being a student in those type of rooms and just seeing that, even if you're not the one who's suspended, that is reinforcing or that is setting you up for not positive outcomes necessarily, because it is sending several messages to you. One being that school might be a punitive place. And that's not the message that we want to send kids. So yeah. Interesting study, for sure.
Fascinating stuff. And I will say, though, one thing you said earlier that we don't have time to get into today, but I think we're going to have to come back to this as a topic in one of our upcoming episodes, is the term school to prison pipeline, which is a very popular term. But I want to trouble the waters around the term.
Do you want to trouble the waters?
I do.
Just like you wanted to with opportunity gap? Or achievement gap?
In a very similar way, in fact. Yes, in a very similar way. I think, yes, we have a problem with mass incarceration in this country.
We do.
Period. End of sentence. It's super racist. Period. End of sentence.
I feel like there's another sentence coming, though.
And the root of that problem is not the schools. Yeah. So, like if we graph mass incarceration and suspension in schools, they did not begin like the rise of mass suspensions and zero tolerance policies did not cause the rise of mass incarceration in this country, right? The war on drugs did, and that had very little to do with classroom discipline policy. So. There's a whole lot more to talk about there. I don't mean to like drop a bomb and then run away.
That's a bomb right there, man. There's people writing dissertations right now using that terminology.
I think it's much like the achievement gap and the opportunity gap. It presents us with an opportunity to be more precise with our language, while naming the very problematic things in our society that we need to fix.
More precise with our language, which is sort of the cornerstone or the the main goal of having a lexicon
Indeed.
style
Indeed.
do now. So that precision with our language is important. Words do matter. And we're going to revisit that because we're going to talk about that. School to prison pipeline. But up next, we do have our seminar, which for today, there are many folks out there who left the teaching profession for reasons that might be related to student behavior and suspensions and conditions. Others who had low points for reasons not related to student behavior. But we are going to take a moment to talk about career trajectories and times when you really ask yourself or question whether or not teaching or working in education is for you, for all the various reasons out there. So stay tuned. Seminar segment about our low points in teaching.
All right, folks, welcome to today's seminar. I am excited to have with us today our official senior middle school correspondent, none other than Genevieve DuBose Akinagbe.
Yeah.
You've seen her here before. She's back, brilliant mind and experienced educator, working with young people and teachers from New York to LA and back again. Yes. And she is here with us today. So very excited to have you, Genevieve. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah. So today's conversation is, I think, a really interesting one because it's really more about the professional growth and experience of educators. And I think it's fair to say, particularly folks who have worked in, in really dynamic, complex, urban, Title I, low income, whatever adjective you want to put on it, but in school contexts where, the school is asked to carry lots of, of the work of meeting the needs of the community, that comes with a certain set of challenges and a certain set of tolls as educators. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes get in that place of being in a funk or, questioning, is this the right path for me? Did I make the right choice? And here we are, three people who have navigated those experiences.
We made it.
made it is maybe a strong term.
Yes.
But we're still here.
We're presently here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, Genevieve, I'm wondering if you can maybe start off just telling us a bit about kind of your personal journey, your personal story, and times when you've confronted maybe some of those challenges and how you've navigated them.
Absolutely. So when we discussed this topic, I immediately went to my 11th year of teaching, which was my hardest year ever, right? You'd think 11 years, you got it down, you know what you're doing. But I had been out of the classroom for 3 years doing policy work, and I really missed teaching, and I missed being with students and colleagues. So I was like, I'm going back to middle school. And I got my butt kicked all year long by 107th graders. Like they worked me up and down. It was the hardest year. And I think I was at a new school. I had been out of the game for 3 years, so I forgot a lot of things. There were things that, I think as teachers we just do naturally or we've learned to do that I had forgotten. It was also the Common Core standards had been rolled out in my absence, so that was something that was new. But that year, my kids were just, not only was I out of practice, but I also had a really challenging group of students. So I had a lot of students that had really high needs, like social emotional needs, but also academic needs. Mm-hmm. And I was new to my school community, so, it was tough. But what it forced me to do was I became a much better teacher as a result. So part of that was like, I would go home and I was like your first year where you're in tears and you're like, what is happening? Like I never cried in front of kids, but I did cry at home. And what it forced me to do was become really reflective, which I'm a reflective practitioner, but I had to go deep in that year. And I started by asking my kids, I reached out to my students and I was like, I said, I don't really know. I'm really good at relationships, but I didn't really rock out with my relationships that year. So I kicked off, I had 3 different cohorts of students, and I started like dessert with Miss DuBose. And I went and I said, I'm going to pick one kid from each cohort for the last 20 minutes of lunch. I'm going to invite you upstairs for cookies and sparkling water. and we sat around a table and we tried to figure out 4 things that we had in common, the 4 of us, right? And it was beautiful. And of course, I started with my students that I struggled the most with, right?
Right.
And we had really wonderful conversations, and that worked a little bit, but things weren't improving. And so then I kicked off this anonymous Friday feedback form where I was like, let me ask my kids what's working and what's not. And I kid you not, so the form had 5 questions. It was, what do you like about this class and why? What don't you like about this class and why? Are you able to learn in this space? What can your teachers do to make this a better learning space for you? And is there anything else you want to say? I would read
That's a dangerous last question.
Yeah, what
there.
else do you want to share? Oh my gosh, I would read those and like basically cry on the BX19 bus on my way home from work. Because what do you like about this class? Nothing. What don't you like? I mean, what don't you like? Everything. Mr. Bose. You know what I'm like?
Wow.
So, but what I did find, there was one gem. I mean, there were many gems, but one gem that still resonates with me is I had a student say, Mr. Bose, is there anything else you want to share? Question. If students like the work, we'll do it. And that just resonated with me. And so that pushed me to then ask kids, hey, for our 3rd unit, it was going to be all around scholar activism. I was like, I invited every student. I gave them each an invitation for an after-school planning meeting. And I said, for 100 kids, there'll be cookies, there'll be sparkling water. Come and help me plan our next unit. And 11 of them showed up. And those 11 kids and I planned the unit, and they said they wanted more technology. They wanted to pick their groups more. They wanted to incorporate art. And so that was our most successful unit because they had a say. So those practices, I would never have done that had my year been going smoothly, you know? But now those are things that I continued to do. And so it just reminds me that when things are really hard, it really forces us to be creative, right? And to also reach out to our kids, which I think we try to do, but sometimes in the daily grind of teaching, we sometimes forget. Yeah. So that was my hardest year. That was my hardest year, guys. And it got better. It got better. And now, actually, those kids are seniors, and I'll go to their high school graduation this June.
Oh,
so
wow.
we really bonded. After things went down, I got to teach some of them as 8th graders, and they stayed at our school because it was a 6 through 12. So we had a tight connection, but it was tough.
Man.
It was tough, yeah. I had kids being like, your mother, all kinds of stuff. It was bad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What about you? When's it been tough for you?
Yeah, so, I mean, for me, so yours being in the 11th year is actually really interesting because you would think, by then, you've made it.
Right.
So mine was in year 5. So my first 4 years were back in my hometown of Sacramento. Shout out Sacramento and all my Sacktown peeps.
Sacktown.
And my first 4 were great. I mean, my first year, I know, there's a commonality amongst teachers that the first year is just so intense and so difficult. But my first year, I mean, it was intense and a lot of things happened that year. I had a lot of wild things happen in and out of the classroom. But overall, it was great. I loved it. And students really loved my class. And I remember my principal at the time saying, man, you have a lot of gang members in your class and they really love your class. And I was just thinking, the principal sees them as gang members and they're not quite.
They're students. Yeah.
But in any case, but yeah, everyone loved my class. I loved being there. My 4 years were actually really smooth. And the only thing is I really got tired of living in Sacramento. I grew up there and I was just, as a young professional, especially at the time, I was just bored and wanted to come back down to Southern California where I went to undergrad at UCLA. So I came down and there's a school that was reconstituting and I didn't really know what that meant. But at the time, that's 2008 and the economy was starting to go south and there weren't a lot of teaching jobs available anywhere really. So when I was looking for teaching jobs across LA, it was all charter schools and I just didn't want to step into a charter school in LA without knowing much about the organization or any of the context around it. So the one public school that I found that was hiring high school, traditional public school, was reconstituting. So the whole staff was being made to reapply for the positions and the schools being broken up into 3 academies and a whole lot was happening. But it sounded like an excellent opportunity to be part of change and reform from somewhat the ground up in terms of coming in, and it's a fresh start for everybody in terms of academy structure, admin, teachers, and everything. And all of that change actually was a lot more difficult than I anticipated it being. So stuff that was easy in my previous school in terms of me just having a certain demeanor in class and students really like responding well to that. Here, it was just like, nah, like none of the little tricks I used to work that used to work in my first 4 years worked here, and my management was just a mess. Like it was just chaotic, and I remember thinking like walking into it, everyone was talking about how quote unquote bad the school is and how crazy it is, this and all these like, and I'm like, man, my principal said I'm good with gang members, I'm good, and it wasn't even that, like there wasn't any violence or anything like that, but it was just a matter of like what they said was there was some truth to it, that students were definitely having to adjust to all the newness, all the new faces, the new structure. It was block scheduling, new academies, all that stuff. And me just using the same methods that worked previously, that just blew up in my face. And I remember one particular class of sophomores, I had them, this is the block after lunch, and it was just always so loud and so messy, and my roster was changing on a daily basis, 4 in, 4 out, and it was just all this. And I remember my lunch periods just like trying to take a deep breath and just trying to like calm myself, because my anxiety would peak, and every day was something different. Kids trying to fight each other, kids just totally not like ignoring, like I have a teacher nightmare that I'm sure a lot of teachers have, which is like you're trying to do any kind of lesson and like no one seems to hear you, and it's just a complete mess. I don't know if any of y'all have ever had that teacher nightmare, but that was like the reality, like students just like being oblivious to me being there. In my previous school, I could like do the tough love thing and like, I need you to do this, that, and they'd step up to it. Here it was just like, yeah, whatever. So I remember come November, I was like, you know what? Maybe my previous experience was just not accurate. Maybe I'm not a good teacher. And because I tried everything. I mean, I tried everything that I was reading up on different types of techniques and trying to really adjust, and nothing was working. And I remember during my periods off, come November, I was looking for other work, like straight up, and not in education. I was just thinking like, man, it'd be so much easier just to be in a cubicle somewhere. Like that would be so much easier. And I remember looking, and again, it was a Great Recession or the beginning of it. So there was nothing available. One job that I almost applied for was being a trainer for Chevron gas stations, like training like folks on, I don't know what, but I was like, training, that's kind of teaching. Maybe that's something. Yeah.
That is a low point, man.
It was a low point.
No disrespect to the Chevron employees out there,
for
but
sure.
I just can't imagine you as a Chevron trainer.
I was like, yo, that'll be I'm just dealing with a couple adults, and then I'll figure out my life after that. Yeah. And but no, it was a really, really, really low point. Nothing I was saying seemed to get through. And now looking back, a lot of those students I'm still in contact with. I had them sophomores, but then I had them again as juniors and seniors. So eventually, the whole it gets better. It got a lot better, partly because there was so much turmoil and transition during that time. There were a lot of students on campus who really needed services above and beyond what our campus could offer. So my class, I had a class of sophomores, but I had a lot of like 19-year-olds, 20-year-old, almost 20-year-olds who just were credits wise, just like no business being a traditional high school, because that for sure wasn't the place that they'd be able to succeed in. And it was just really chaotic. So once some of that chaos died down, and once the rosters became a little more consistent on a day-to-day basis, and once students realized that I'm not leaving, when I realized that I'm not leaving, and also once I began to learn a lot more about the students and their what they were coming in with, we sort of met like a kind of happy place in the spring. And by the end of that year, I got laid off because it was a Great Recession, first of 3 layoffs. But by the end of that year, it was really like, you know what, this is the place for me. And we had some rough patches, and it seemed like the students, it's kind of sounds similar to your story, like the students sort of realized it, you sort of realized it, and adjustments were made. And 2 years later, I was like in probably the peak of my career in terms of everything going great and me loving it and students loving me. So yeah, dark days for sure. For sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear both of your stories as someone who's probably the furthest from the classroom in the group here. And I entered teaching knowing that I wanted to be a principal, and knowing that for me, teaching was it felt like a really important foundational experience. Right. But I had this, I'd had this principal in high school who really inspired me, and And I kind of came into it thinking I wanted to be a principal. And I started teaching it. Just it was in many ways a great place because there was a small, close-knit cohort of adults that really cared, but it was a super dysfunctional school that wound up being closed, and frankly, deservedly so. And I remember at the end of my first year of teaching, we had graduation. And it had been earlier that week so it was a high school that was located inside of a junior high school in East Harlem. And the junior high school had graduation. And I grew up in the Midwest where like middle school graduations, kindergarten graduations, like they're really not a big deal, at least where I grew up, right? So, people come, you take pictures or whatever, but there's not like families pulling up in limos and like it's not a big deal, right? Like grandma does not come to town for 8th grade graduation. And in New York, it's a whole different ballgame. Like 8th grade graduation, like people do it big. So I saw all these kids in caps and gowns and like folks dressed up in suits and stuff. And I was like, oh, I guess in New York, like graduations are just a big deal. So fast forward about a week, and the high school that I was working at in the same building has graduation, and we had 7 students graduate. Now this was a small high school, but still it was a high school with 300, maybe 330 kids, right? And we had 7 students on stage. And it was literally the most depressing thing I've ever seen in my entire life. And so I'm in this auditorium looking around like, am I the only one that sees the insanity of what's happening? Like, we just watched a whole junior high school with caps and gowns, and here we are with 7 kids that are like on stage, right? Like they fit on stage because there's only 7 of them. And so that was just the most depressing thing I'd ever seen, literally. So right after the ceremony, I got up, I walked out, I walked around the block. So the school was kind of nestled in a set of housing projects. So it was like a big block. So I walked all the way around the block. I sat down. One corner of it was like a little park. So I sat down in the park and I called my dad. And I was like, I just saw the craziest thing like I've ever seen. Like, I don't know, maybe I made the wrong choice, in my profession. And I had been debating whether to go to law school or whether to go to ed school. Do I want to be like Thurgood Marshall or do I want to be, an educator? And I had really thought that I had made the right choice, but that I think was the closest time I've ever come to being like, maybe Chevron is hiring. Like, I'm not sure. I might be doing the wrong thing here. Thankfully we had a conversation and kind of just worked through it a bit. But that, I think to me, that was like my darkest moment as an educator. That really had me on the brink, but thankfully, was able to walk back and find a much better path as an educator to be on. So yeah.
We're grateful that you did not go to law school.
I mean,
that's probably
too.
a good. You would have done education law probably.
I mean, I was definitely on the like civil rights law trajectory, but I am glad I didn't go that route now, or I'm happy, I should say, that I stuck it out in education. But so hearing all of us talk, I think there's, I think in some ways this kind of phenomenon of like grappling with really challenging situations, being in a context where maybe the supports are not quite there, is very common for people in our field. So I'm wondering if now, as more wise, more sophisticated sages, as an official middle school correspondent
senior
pardon me.
Come on, you better respect the position, man.
Respect the
senior
title.
Middle school correspondent, Genevieve. I'm wondering maybe some of your thoughts about, as a profession, what can we do better so that fewer people are having the kinds of experiences that we just described?
I feel like that's such a loaded question because there's so much that we can do a better job of in education. But when I think about what has sustained me most, honestly, it's been breaks. Like, I've had opportunities to not be teaching, whether I was doing something connected to education or whether I was in like a hybrid role, that has actually been incredibly powerful in sustaining me in this work, because this is hard work, right? And if I think of folks I know who are career educators 30 years in, and they've been a teacher for 30 years straight. And I'm like, wow, like that. I started teaching 20 years ago, like in 1999, but that, of those 20 years, I've only been in the classroom 14 years, right? I've had 6 years of breaks, right? Like where I was either doing policy work or even in the role that I'm in now as a literacy coach, right? That feels like a break to me, because the intensity of teaching is so deep that you need a mental break. And so I think if our profession were structured in a way where teachers could have, like, why not have a teacher teach for 5 years and then have a year at the district office, like, you know, learn, like, being a teacher perspective around, or learning how the district works, right? That's going to inform the folks at the district and the decisions they make, but also it's going to inform that teacher's practice when they go back to the classroom, right? Or in roles where you could be, even if you were teaching, you know, 75% of the time, but the other 25% of the time you're working on family engagement for your school, right? Like that's a type of a break that I think would not only inform best practices at the school, but also create a more sustainable profession, because teachers, the best teachers I know are continual learners, and like we want to keep learning and we want to keep growing, and you do grow a ton in the classroom, and there are lots of like education is such a multifaceted field that there are so many other ways to grow, you know. And I wish I see pockets of places doing some of that work, but I wish like that was just the norm nationally in education, that we were giving teachers opportunities to use their expertise and learn outside of the classroom, knowing that you're coming back. You know, it's like that it's a cycle, that it's you don't have to be there for 20 years straight unless that's what you want, right? But if that's not what you want, and you know, hey, I want to learn this too, but my heart's with kids, that's, you know, I think that would build more sustainability in our profession as one way to do it. You know?
Yeah, I think a similarity that exists between our three stories is that we're each working in a community that's marginalized, with a population that had a host of challenges that they needed to get support with. So I know for me in my class, what really helped me was mentorship from other educators at the school, especially educators of color who were more familiar with the community than I was. So when I think about what more can be done within our profession to help sustain and help empower teachers throughout, and not feel this sense of just like throwing your hands up like nothing's working or nothing's, this just isn't possible for me, is for one, having more educators of color who are coming from a similar perspective. So for me, I was walking in, even though this was not my community, I saw it as very similar to the community I grew up in. However, like I was coming in as an outsider. Period. So even though, you know, my first 4 years, that community, I grew up there, so I knew people knew me. Like I had that extra context that helped me be successful and tap in and build those relationships with students. Here, after those first 4 years when I moved, it was more of a like, I'm an outsider and I don't know anybody and I don't understand the dynamics and the connections here. So for example, I wasn't used to the conflict that existed between two specific demographics on our school side at that time. But I had two mentors, I'll shout them out right now, Mr. Harrison, Mr. Bynum, who had been here for, Harrison grew up here and Bynum was working here for a long, long time. They've each since retired. But both of them like really pulled me aside and really helped me out in terms of understanding this, that, and whatever. So one student that I had, who I'm still in contact with, who was especially challenging, like, you know, I called home on the kid, this, that, whatever, but Harrison let me know, like, yo, just so you know, his father is gone for life and his mother is incarcerated at the moment, and he's bouncing around between this home and that home. And I'm saying this now because this student has spoken about it plenty, and he actually recently had a interview on YouTube where he was talking about that year, that 10th grade year, me and Bynum and Harrison trying to help him out. So he's Carl Holmes, I'll shout him out. And I didn't know this context. I didn't know all this that he was dealing with outside. And of course, you know, working in a marginalized community, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of factors beyond your control. And we do our best to be ready for that and to learn how to establish, obviously, trauma-informed practices, but also that relational capacity to help students out in that context. But in my 5th year, I was still really new at any of that. And it really was overwhelming me. So having other educators of color in the building and getting their advice and their help and being able to team up with them on particular students. So as the school year continued and as the transition and everything was started to settle down some, I became more familiar with the other teachers in the building. They became more familiar with me, and we were able to coordinate efforts on particular students, which also helped. So for me, when I think about schools where the staff is continually rotating, where educators of color in particular are coming in wanting to do the best by the students there and help serve maybe the community that they even grew up in, but there's no mentorship there's no support from other teachers, and every day, it's somebody else next door to you, next to your classroom. I think that is beyond overwhelming, and I think that's where a lot of the work would need to be done in terms of making sure, like you shared in I think it was a show and tell in season 2, where you talked about the need for high quality teachers in every classroom, but particularly classrooms with the highest need, like that being a focus, and that being an area where we really pay particular attention to investments being made in certain schools and making sure that you don't have teachers. I know you've discussed previously having teachers who are just not interested and way over the hill, and admin being locked in and not being able to really do something with that particular teacher that is doing more harm than good. And looking at those practices and seeing how could we make sure that in these most high need environments that we have the best quality teachers that the district could find right there with the right support and connections and mentors around to help them out. So that's where I go when I think about like what could be done to, that would have helped me definitely avoid that, hitting that wall and looking for other jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of wisdom has been shared from both of you, and I wonder in our last couple of minutes here if you might also bless us with just a little bit more of that wisdom around for maybe some folks in our audience who are educators themselves, who are grappling with maybe some of the same kinds of lower points in their career trajectory, and when you're in those points, you don't have the perspective that like 30 years from now you'll look at the graph and it'll be fine and it'll dip and then it'll be fine, right? But it doesn't feel like that at the time. So what words of wisdom might you offer in closing to educators who are struggling with that themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk at length about this, but I won't because we only have a few minutes. But I think of 3 things. I think of like find your crew, right? Like kind of like what Manuel was just saying around the folks that mentored him. But who are your people? Like who are the people that you can connect with and feel safe being vulnerable with, like, and tap into them. The second thing I'll say is also like look to your kids, right? Like same for me when I had that really hard year. I would not have reached out to my kids the way I did, but our students, we spend the most time with them.
Yeah.
During the school day, they have the best insight as to whether we're doing our job well or not, right? So reach out to them, as vulnerable as it may feel, like ask for their feedback. And then I'd also say like tap into like your passions and what brings you joy in the profession or just in life. And I think a lot of folks are afraid to talk with their administrators, but like be up in your principal's office regularly. Like, hey, I have this idea. Like, can we take our kids on this field trip? Or, hey, I'm into theater. Like, how can I incorporate theater more in my, tap into what sustains you and take that, because I think principals, it's a benefit for the school as well, right? Like principals they don't have the same view that a teacher has. So it helps them if you're reaching out to them, because then they know their kids and their staff better. So yeah, reach out and bring your passions to what you're doing, because that makes the work that much more enjoyable. Yeah.
So Manuel, we heard from Genevieve some thoughts about advice for educators out there who may be listening, maybe watching, and are in it themselves and wondering if they made the right choice or if this is the right career to stay in for them. What pearls of wisdom might you offer to them or to folks who are in that situation?
Yeah, I would say one thing that I would say is that conditions change, depending on your school site and depending on your district, conditions change like year by year. And the school that I described is not anything like that anymore, So I thought I was going crazy because nothing I was doing was working, and here I was basically looking for other opportunities. And a lot of the issues that were causing those problems were above and beyond my control. And as a lot of those got sorted out, and myself and my students were able to really just settle into the school year, I was able to tap back into all the things that I loved about teaching. So one thing that I would say to anybody really considering whether or not this is for them or not is to really try to reflect on what is it that is causing the most anxiety or the most amount of like frustration within you, and how much of that is something that is a reflection of your individual practices versus a reflection of the conditions around you. Because if it's about your individual practices, then of course I would second what Genevieve said about, in terms of thinking about yourself, tapping into yourself, reaching out for support from others, and really rethinking your relationship with the students and what more could be done. Like how she reached out to her students and legitimately just asked, like, look, what's working, what's not working, what could I do, and all of that. That's something that is something that I think any teacher brave enough to do or could do. But beyond that, if it's things beyond your classroom, one thing is to remember that it's not just you dealing with it, but it's also the students. And I had to keep reminding myself that, for one, it's not personal, and that's I think the first bit of like wisdom I got from my mentor teacher when I was student teaching was that it was like, oh yeah, I don't take anything personal. Like, they barely know me, so how could it be personal? And when teachers start taking it personal and start internalizing their feelings, then things go from bad to worse. And I have some issues with the framing of teaching as not being personal, because it's very personal in a lot of ways. However, reminding myself that, these kids aren't wilding out because they don't like me as a person, and they're not wilding out because of something that I'm doing to them. Like, they're dealing with a host of issues, and a lot of this, they're basically being set up in such a way that, like, it'd be amazing if they did sit down and just be perfect students in this particular context. So I had to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that the things that were going on, that the students were dealing with it too, and it wasn't just me, but also reaching out for help, reaching out for mentors. So my two mentors, Harrison and Bynum, that was very informal. Like, they were down the hall and they saw the wildness in my classroom, and they had some wildness in their own classroom, and they were able to pull me aside and sort of give me the context and give me the background and help me out and check in with me, and they really built me up. And I know that when it comes to educators of color, especially Black male educators, there's a huge shortage across the country, and you might be in a context where you don't have some OGs like I had to help me out and help sort me out and help support me, and that's struggling. And in that case, I would definitely suggest tapping into educators online and joining professional learning communities, learning networks that exist online to get some of that support. So I would say all those things. And I would also say my darkest year was at 2008-2009 school year. And in a blink of an eye, like, I had the peak of my career, which is being awarded the Milken Educator Award. And that was in 2012. So within 3 to 4 years, my whole everything revolutionized. And I loved everything about my school site. And I continue to love everything about my school site. And looking back, I would have just missed out on just a joyous future if I would have just taken that moment of whatever desperation and just said, that's it. So yeah, I don't know if any of that made sense, but it's what I got.
It did.
It certainly did. I think the only thing I would probably add to what the two of you have said is, and I think in some ways this, what I'm going to say, has become kind of commercialized or something in its own way today, in a way that maybe is good, but I think also kind of cheapens the importance of it in some ways, which is really self-care.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times as educators, we're not therapists, but we inhabit these like kind of quasi-therapeutic spaces with kids where when they write something that's like, here's this crazy stuff that's going on in my life, and you're like, oh snap, what am I supposed to do about this? Right? Or we're confronting them about some stupid behavior in the hallways or whatever, and it turns into a thing that then brings mom and dad in, and we realize what's happening, right? And so, or doesn't bring mom and dad in, right? Because we realize that, mom and dad are not available, right? Or whatever the situation may be, right? And so I think there's just so much of the emotional stress that our students are dealing with that comes onto us as educators, and that the families that we're dealing with, that comes onto us as educators, that we give in order to be supportive, in order to be, the mandated reporter we need to be, or whatever it is, right? That are extremely stressful situations. And I think, we live in this world where folks do, like yoga and Pilates, and it's like this thing that is a product that gets sold rather than like things that people need to do, whether it's like having a hot cup of tea or talking to your parents or going for a walk or making sure you're eating vegetables or, making sure you're getting enough sleep. But doing the things that you need as an educator who's constantly in a position of giving, whether it's the principal who's having to give to, to teachers, or whether it's teachers who have to give to students, or whether it's a, campus aide who has to give to everyone who asks, right? But you can't just give, right? You've also got to make sure you're taking in and really, taking care of yourself, because you're not going to be able to be effective in the classroom if you're not bringing your best self to the table. And so it's easy, I think, in helping professions, and frankly, I think easy in professions where historically the folks who've done the work have been primarily women and are, kind of like expected to do the giving. It's easy to just fall into that, right? And not protect the integrity of yourself along the way. And so I think that's just something important I would offer for educators out there as well. You have permission to take care of yourself too. Like getting enough sleep shouldn't be a luxury item.
Absolutely.
That's facts.
Yeah. And I was just recently at an event with Jason Reynolds and LeVar Burton, and LeVar Burton said that exact thing. He said, protect your asset, and you are your asset, right? Like you can't give to others if you're not taking care of yourself. So teachers need to remember, and educators, to protect their asset. Absolutely.
And I feel like any conversation that ends with a LeVar Burton quote,
that's just facts.
I feel like we should put a pin in it right there, because it's not going to get any better than it just got. I love LeVar Burton.
I know.
Reading Rainbow, all time
Roots,
favorite.
Star Trek, all of it. Yeah.
Lieutenant Jordy LaForge.
Just want to give him a hug.
In the house.
He's such a warm individual.
Dope earring, little earring.
All that.
Remember all that? Yeah.
All right. Well, folks, I think that brings us to a wonderful end of today's seminar. And thank you for joining this conversation with us. I hope you pulled some pearls from it. I know I did, even just talking to these two brilliant folks here. And I want to give a special thanks to our senior middle school correspondent. That title means you're going to be seeing Genevieve with a little more regularity this season. And as we go forward with the show, she always brings a wonderful perspective to us. So thanks for being here, senior correspondent.
Thank you. I'm proud to be the all of the above senior middle school correspondent.
Yes.
Looking forward to a wonderful season.
All right. Thanks, folks. And next up is our class dismissed. All right, folks, we have arrived at our class dismissed. Thanks for joining us in today's episode. And this is the time when we pause to kind of reflect and give some shout outs to people doing amazing things out there in our field of education. And I am thrilled today to give a special shout out to the one and only Jonathan Hines, who is, as some of you may have seen online, the new pre-K Educator of the Year in the state of Georgia. And he is the first black man to receive that award. So we want to give a huge shout out to Jonathan Hines. Now, Jonathan Hines was named the 1920 Pre-K Teacher of the Year by the Georgia Department of Education's Bright from the Start Early Education, Early Care and Learning agency down there in the state of Georgia. He is going to receive, as a part of this award, a $7,500 award.
Nice.
$2,000 goes to the school, $2,500 goes to his classroom, and then $3,000 he gets to do what he wants with. He's going to be traveling the state to share instructional tips and meet with folks. So just a wonderful story. It's great to see in a field where we have such a shortage of black men, this amazing young man just doing incredible work with the youngest students, the little, the little ones, the 4-year-olds down there in Georgia. So props, Jonathan. Shout out to you, seriously, from all the above.
Absolutely. And you better not use that money to buy supplies for your classroom. You've earned that money. Do something fun with it. It's for you. You don't have to feel guilty. I know how teachers are when they come across some extra funds that they didn't anticipate. And I could use this to this. We could do this cool project and that cool project. Nope. Use it for you. You've earned it. All right, folks. Thank you for watching our latest episode and listening if you're listening on the go. Please remember to follow, rate us, review us. That makes a big difference when it comes to those algorithms. And if you haven't already followed us on Twitter, we are at AOTA Show, and we post a bunch of clips there and a bunch of other extra stuff. So head on over there and follow, and we will see you next time.